Hello everyone. We will be finishing up Unit 11 today with Module 64, which looks at group differences and the question of bias. So don't forget to jot down some notes and send me a picture. All right, so looking at gender similarities and differences that show up on intelligence test scores. Males typically rate their own intelligence higher. That is not to say that they believe that they will perform better than females. What this means is that males tend to rate their own intelligence higher than females do. They also tend to outperform females in spatial abilities. I don't know if you've ever seen those questions where you have like weird block shapes and then they flip them all around and you have to figure out which block shape matches the one in the sample, but they're all flipped around. I do terrible at those personally. Greg does very well. So males tend to outperform females with those types of questions. They also tend to do better on complex math problems. In terms of overall math performance and like math computation, there's hardly any difference in intelligence scores on that basis, but when it comes to complex math problems, males tend to do better. And they also have more intelligence extremes. So if you're looking at a special education class, there does tend to be more males in those classrooms than females. But then on the other hand, if you're looking at people who score very high, like on the math portion of the SAT, those too tend to be males because they have more intelligence extremes. It's not staggered, so sorry. Females tend to perform better in spelling, in verbal fluency, in sensation, in terms of being able to like distinguish between colors and pick up on smells or sensitivity to touch. Females generally do better in those categories. And they are also better at detecting emotions, whether or not someone is sad or happy, or being able to look at someone's expression and tell what emotion they are feeling. Okay, so social and cultural influences can cause this discrepancy between males and females. So this is not necessarily something that is genetic that causes guys to have a better spatial ability or be able to solve complex math problems, or for girls to do better in verbal fluency. This also has to do with cultural preferences. And this too would explain why in the United States, women tend to avoid math type vocations. It's almost like being an engineer or a scientist or a mathematician or things like that are typically culturally male vocations. And women tend to go toward like nursing or teaching or something like that. I will say that even in the United States, the boy to girl ratio for math scores that gap is closing. One study looked at 12 to 14-year-old Americans who had very high SAT math scores, and those rates declined from 13 to 1 to 3 to 1 since the 70s. So in a matter of like 50 years, that gap went from 12 to 1 to 3 to 1, male to female. And then in looking at the ratio of women to men earning doctorates, it went from 17% women in 1958 to 70% women in 2015. So it's not like a genetic thing that causes men to be better at one thing or women. A lot of times it's simply a cultural or social preference. All right, so looking at racial and ethnic similarities and differences. So to start with, there are some scientific facts. Number one is that racial and ethnic groups do actually differ on average intelligence test scores. And so there is a difference between racial and ethnic groups. Also, higher scoring people and groups receive more education and more income. So starting with that premise, we'll look at the possible causes of that. So we've talked about the fact that there are some genetic differences in individuals that cause some individuals to have more intelligence than others. But researchers, scientists, and psychologists do not believe that there's a genetic difference that would make Kenyans smarter than Mexicans or something like that. They believe that this is something that is environmental, and there's a couple of reasons why they look at the causes as being environmental and not genetic when you're looking at differences in group performance on intelligence tests. Number one is that genetics research shows that beneath the skin, we are very, very similar. So if you were to perform an autopsy and you were just seeing the brain and the body underneath, there are not really noticeable differences. Another thing is that race is not a neatly defined biological category. And more so, social scientists are seeing race as a social construction, not really a physical one. As time has gone on and races have blended with other races, there really aren't well-defined physical categories for race. There's not like a neat way to categorize different races. Okay, another reason why researchers think this might be environmental and not genetic is that people score higher on IQ tests today than they did in the 1930s. And they do not think that people today, modern people, have a better genetic code than people 90 years ago. And so this leads researchers to believe that the reason why there are differences is not because of genetics, but because of the fact that we are better fed, we are better educated, and we are more prepared to take intelligence tests than people were 90 years ago. And so this is a cultural or environmental thing, not a genetic thing. All right, another reason why people think that these differences are caused by environmental factors is because when whites and blacks today receive the same pertinent knowledge, they then receive similar scores. And so genetics doesn't really account for that. If both blacks and whites have the information that they need, then they score in a similar way. Also, schools and culture matter. These are both very important factors when looking at intelligence, and we know that because countries that have a large wealth gap have a large intelligence test score gap too. So typically the people who live in a rich portion of a country score better than those who live in a poor section of the country. This is true in both China and Turkey, where people who live in the poorest regions of the country also have the lowest intelligence scores. Those who live in the wealthiest section have the highest scores. So this would point to the fact that there are environmental causes to these intelligence differences. Another example would be Asian students who have performed better on intelligence tests than North American students due to the fact that they spend 30% more of their time in school, and they also spend much more time studying outside of school. So that's not a genetic thing, that is an environmental thing. All right, and so another interesting thing that points to environmental causes in intelligence differences for groups is that in different eras, groups have experienced golden ages. So 2,500 years ago, the Greeks and the Egyptians had golden ages, and there were lots of, works of art and works of literature, science, medicine, all sorts of cultural flowering. And it wasn't that that group of Greeks or that group of Egyptians had a better genetic makeup. This was environmental. Then after that, it was the Romans in the 8th and the 9th centuries. It was the Arabs, and so on and so forth. So this points to the fact that intelligence score differences are probably environmental, not genetic. All right, so 2 meanings of bias. So we have to look at the test itself. Are these intelligence tests biased? And so there's a couple of ways to look at it. Number one is in the scientific sense. Is the test valid? If a test is valid, then it predicts the future behavior for groups of test takers. So if the SAT accurately predicts college achievement of women but not of men, then the test would be biased. Fortunately, the SAT doesn't really do that. If an intelligence test score of 95 predicts slightly below average grades for men, for women, for blacks and whites, then that would be a non-biased test. The test would be valid. On the other hand, in the popular sense, does the test predict differences caused by cultural experiences? For instance, Eastern European immigrants in the early 1900s were given intelligence tests, but they were asked like culturally American type questions. And because they were not yet familiar with the English language or American culture, many of them, or most of them, scored very low and were therefore classified as feeble-minded. And so that would be a biased intelligence test because it's looking for cultural factors. All right, so another thing that it can impact how a student or how a group of people perform on a test is the test taker's expectations. There was one researcher, Stephen Spencer, in 1997, who gave a really hard math test to equally capable men and women. And women did not do as well on this test unless they had been led to expect that women usually do as well on the test as men do. And so it's like they were expecting to struggle on the test, and then that affected their performance. There was a threat present, and this is called stereotype threat. So a stereotype threat would be like if you feel like you're going to be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. There have been follow-up studies that have shown that Black students perform worse after being reminded of their race right before taking a verbal aptitude test. And then there are similar studies where Blacks perform better on tests if they are tested by Black teachers, and they perform worse if they're tested by white teachers. They feel like their test taker may have a negative stereotype about them, and it causes them to perform poorly. And this is true in one study with women too, where they performed more poorly when they thought that it was men administering the test. And so stereotype threat can be a hindrance to performing well on an intelligence test. All right, so that is all. Have a great day. Don't forget to send me a picture of your notes.